The rain hammered Oxford's cobblestones with the persistence of grief, each drop a small accusation against the November sky. Dr. Elias Rowe pulled his coat tighter as he approached the narrow townhouse on Holywell Street, keys cold in his palm like dead fingers. Uncle Mortimer's death had been as peculiar as his life, found in his study at 3:33 a.m., seated upright at his desk, pen still in hand, face serene as if he'd simply decided to stop breathing between one word and the next. The solicitor had been apologetic but firm. Everything went to Elias, the only surviving relative. Books, manuscripts, artifacts, decades of collecting what the church had deemed unsuitable for scholarly pursuit. Elias had resigned his priesthood 15 years ago, trading collar for doctorate, Latin masses for lecture halls. He thought himself beyond such superstitions now. The key turned with surprising ease. Inside, dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light filtering through leaded windows. The house smelled of parchment and something else, sandalwood mixed with something metallic, like old coins left too long in a pocket. Elias made his way to the study, where Uncle Mortimer had spent most of his waking hours. Floor-to-ceiling shelves groaned under the weight of texts in languages both familiar and foreign, Hebrew, Latin, Greek, but also scripts that seemed to writhe when viewed peripherally, characters that suggested meanings just beyond comprehension. On the massive oak desk sat a wooden crate, roughly the size of a shoebox but heavier, bound with iron bands that had gone green with age. A note in Mortimer's spidery handwriting was pinned beneath one corner. Elias, if you're reading this, then the time has come for someone else to bear this burden. The contents are authentic, though I pray you will have more wisdom than I. The translation is incomplete by design. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Your uncle, who loved you more than his own salvation. M. Elias set the note aside with a bitter laugh. Even in death, Mortimer couldn't resist his theatrical flair. The old man had spent 40 years collecting medieval forgeries and Renaissance hoaxes, convinced that somewhere in the morass of occult nonsense lay genuine mysteries. It had cost him his position at Cambridge, his marriage, and ultimately his sanity. The iron bands resisted his attempts to pry them loose. He found a letter opener in the desk drawer and worked at the metal until it finally gave way with a sound like breaking bones. Inside, nestled in what looked like centuries-old straw, lay a manuscript unlike any he'd encountered in 20 years of academic study. The binding was human skin, unmistakably so, with the telltale texture and faint scarring that no animal hide possessed. The pages within were vellum, thick and yellowed with age, covered in text that made his eyes water to look at directly. The script was Latin, but wrong somehow, as if written by someone who understood the grammar but not the soul of the language. At the top of the first page, in letters that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, was written, Octavum Sigillum Palonis, the Eighth Seal of Palon. Elias had studied the Ars Goetia extensively during his doctoral work, that infamous 17th century grimoire cataloging 72 demons and their conjurations. He knew every duke and marquis, every earl and president of hell's supposed hierarchy. But this was something else entirely. The text spoke of 8 seals, not 7, and attributed them not to King Solomon, but to someone called Palon the Crowned. He photographed each page meticulously before attempting translation. The Latin was archaic, filled with grammatical constructions that predated even the medieval period. But slowly, painstakingly, meaning began to emerge. Know that the 8th seal bindeth not the servant but the master, that he who speaketh these words with true understanding shall taste of wisdom that burns the tongue and blinds the eye. Let him who would know the price of knowledge first count the cost of ignorance. By the time Elias looked up from his work, darkness had claimed the study. He'd been translating for 6 hours without pause, driven by an academic fervor he hadn't felt since his graduate days. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. He gathered up his notes and photographs, locked the manuscript in the desk drawer, and made his way back to his flat in Jericho. The streets were empty, streetlights casting pools of sickly yellow that seemed to ripple like water. Once, he thought he heard footsteps echoing his own, but when he turned, nothing but shadow greeted his gaze. His flat was a modest 2-bedroom affair, one room serving as his office, the other his bedroom. Books lined every available wall space, testament to a life lived more in scholarship than experience. He heated a tin of soup, poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey, and settled in to review his translation notes. The text was fascinating in its contradictions. Where traditional grimoires promised power over spirits, this seal seemed to promise something more dangerous: understanding. Not knowledge of facts or formulae, but comprehension that transformed the knower. The warnings embedded in the text were subtle but persistent. Let him who would drink from this well know that its waters change the vessel that contains them. Elias fell asleep at his desk, whiskey glass empty, notes scattered beneath his cheek. In his dreams, he stood in a vast library where books wrote themselves, their pages turning of their own accord, while unseen hands inscribed words in languages that had never known human tongues. Somewhere in the distance, a harp played, not the gentle melody of earthly music, but something older, deeper, that resonated in his bones rather than his ears. He woke at 3:33 a.m. to the sound of that same harp, echoing up through the floorboards of his flat. Elias sat upright in the darkness, heart hammering against his ribs. The music continued for perhaps 30 seconds more, haunting arpeggios that seemed to climb endlessly upward before dissolving into silence. He waited, breath held, but the sound didn't return. Mrs. Henderson in the flat below was 84 and profoundly deaf. She hadn't played an instrument in the 12 years he'd lived there. The ground floor housed only her parlor and kitchen. There was no basement. He made coffee and tried to rationalize the experience. Auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon during periods of stress, and Mortimer's death had affected him more than he'd admitted. Perhaps the whiskey had interacted poorly with the antihistamine he'd taken for his autumn allergies. Perhaps he'd simply dreamed the whole thing. But when he returned to his translation notes, he found something that stopped him cold. Scattered among his careful academic annotations were symbols he didn't remember drawing, intricate glyphs that hurt to look at directly, as if they contained too much meaning for the human eye to process safely. The pen strokes matched his handwriting exactly, but the characters belonged to no alphabet he'd ever studied. At the university, Elias found concentration impossible. His morning lecture on medieval religious practices felt hollow, the words mechanical. His students, bright young minds hungry for knowledge, seemed to flicker at the edges of his vision, as if they weren't quite solid. During his office hours, a graduate student named Sarah Pemberton came to discuss her thesis on Gnostic influences in early Christian art. "The thing that fascinates me," she said, "is how these heretical texts always claim to offer hidden knowledge, secret truths that Orthodox Christianity supposedly suppressed. But when you actually read them, they're so oblique, as if the authors were afraid to speak plainly." Perhaps they were, Elias found himself saying. Perhaps some truths are dangerous not because they're false, but because they're too true. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That sounds almost mystical, Professor. Are you feeling quite well?" He dismissed her with more haste than courtesy, then spent the remainder of the afternoon in the Bodleian Library researching Palon. The name appeared nowhere in standard sources, not in Agrippa, not in Dee, not even in the most obscure medieval bestiaries. It was as if this particular entity had been carefully excised from the historical record. That evening, Elias returned to Mortimer's study with a flask of tea and a determination to finish the translation. The manuscript seemed heavier than before, its binding warm to the touch despite the November chill. As he worked, shadows gathered in the corners of the room, pooling like spilled ink even when he added more lamps. The deeper he delved into the text, the more disturbing it became. The Eighth Seal wasn't a binding at all, but an invitation, a formal request for audience with something that existed in the spaces between conventional reality. The translation proved increasingly difficult, not because the Latin was corrupted, but because the concepts it described had no equivalent in human language. When the seeker hath spoken the words of opening, let him prepare his mind to receive visions that shall remake his understanding. For Palon the crowned cometh not as conqueror but as teacher, and his lessons are writ in fire upon the soul of the student. Around midnight, Elias found himself sketching again, the same alien symbols that had appeared in his notes the previous night. This time he was aware of drawing them, but the knowledge seemed to come from somewhere outside his conscious mind. The pen moved of its own accord, creating patterns that suggested meaning just beyond his grasp. One symbol in particular drew his attention, a complex glyph that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, as if it existed in more dimensions than the paper could contain. Something about its curves and angles felt familiar, like a half-remembered name on the tip of his tongue. At 3:33 a.m. precisely, the harp began to play. This time Elias was ready. He crept to the window overlooking the small garden behind his building, but saw nothing unusual. No lights in other windows, no figures moving in the darkness. The music seemed to emanate from the earth itself, rising through stone and timber to fill his flat with its impossible melody. Without conscious decision, he found himself humming along. The moment the first note left his lips, the music stopped. In the sudden silence, Elias heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of footsteps directly above his head, in the attic space that didn't exist. His building was only 2 stories high. The footsteps continued for several minutes, slow, deliberate paces that traced the outline of his flat's floor plan. When they finally stopped, Elias remained frozen at his window for another hour, listening to the profound silence that followed. By dawn, he'd almost convinced himself it had been another hallucination. Almost. His reflection in the bathroom mirror looked haggard, eyes bloodshot from too many nights of interrupted sleep. As he shaved, he found himself studying the face staring back at him, searching for signs of the madness that had claimed his uncle. The Rose had always been prone to obsession. It ran in the family like a recessive gene, manifesting in different ways across generations. His father had been obsessed with chess, playing postal games with strangers until his death. His sister had been obsessed with purity, joining a convent and taking vows of silence that she'd maintained for 23 years. And Uncle Mortimer had been obsessed with forbidden knowledge. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, his mother used to say, though she'd meant it fondly at the time. At the university, Elias attempted to maintain his normal routine. He taught his classes, held office hours, attended a faculty meeting about budget allocations. But concentration remained elusive. During a discussion about medieval manuscript preservation, he found himself sketching those strange symbols in the margins of his notes. When Dr. Margaret Thornfield asked him a direct question about humidity controls, he'd been drawing what looked like a simplified version of the complex glyph from the night before. "Elias?" Margaret's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you with us?" He looked up to find 12 colleagues staring at him with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed annoyance. His notepad was covered in symbols, layer upon layer of interconnected glyphs that seemed to writhe when viewed directly. "I'm sorry," he stammered, flipping the pad closed. "I was taking notes." The meeting continued, but he felt their eyes on him for the remainder of the hour. When it finally ended, Margaret lingered as the others filed out. "Are you quite all right?" she asked. "You've seemed distracted lately. Is it the inheritance? I know dealing with a relative's estate can be overwhelming." "I'm fine," Elias lied. "Just tired. I've been working on translating some of Mortimer's manuscripts." "Ah." Margaret's expression shifted to one of gentle warning. "Do be careful with those, won't you? Your uncle's collection was extensive. Not all of it was academically sound." That evening, Elias found himself back in Mortimer's study despite his earlier resolution to take a break from the translation work. The manuscript lay open on the desk exactly as he'd left it, though he was certain he'd closed it the night before. The words seemed clearer now, as if his growing familiarity with the text was making the archaic Latin more comprehensible. Or perhaps the text was changing to accommodate his understanding. The seeker must prepare himself with contemplation of the void that separates knowing from being. In the space between certainty and doubt, Palon dwells, offering wisdom to those who dare confess their ignorance. The passage troubled him. Traditional grimoires were explicit in their instructions, precise words to be spoken at exact times, specific materials to be gathered, careful preparations to ensure the magician's safety. But this text seemed deliberately vague, as if the real ritual existed not in the performance of prescribed actions, but in the psychological transformation of the practitioner. As he worked, shadows lengthened across the study despite the electric lighting. The grandfather clock in the corner had stopped at 3:33, though Elias was certain it had been working when he'd arrived. The house felt different tonight, expectant, as if it were holding its breath. Around 11 o'clock, he discovered something that made him question his sanity entirely. Tucked between pages near the end of the manuscript was a loose sheet of paper covered in his own handwriting. Not symbols this time, but words, a complete translation of the Eighth Seal, written in modern English. The handwriting was unmistakably his own. The paper was aged, yellowed with what looked like decades of handling. But the translation contained information he was certain he hadn't discovered yet, passages he hadn't even attempted to decipher. According to the mysterious translation, the Eighth Seal was not a conjuration but a formal request for instruction. The summoner didn't bind Palon. Instead, they offered themselves as a student, accepting whatever lessons the entity chose to provide. The ritual required no special tools, no protective circles, no elaborate preparations, only the sincere desire to understand regardless of the cost. When the student is ready, speak these words beneath the sign of the Crowned One. Palon, Rex Scientia, Magister Umbrae, I who know nothing call upon you who know all. I offer my certainty as sacrifice, my ignorance as altar. Teach me the price of wisdom, show me the weight of truth. Let understanding remake me as it remade those who came before. But know this, once spoken, these words cannot be unspoken. Once the lesson begins, it continues until the student graduates or is consumed by the attempt. At the bottom of the page, in the same handwriting but different ink, were the words, "The seal is complete, the door is open. Remember, when he offers you the question, answer with uncertainty, not knowledge. Your life depends on admitting what you do not know." Elias stared at the paper until his eyes watered. The handwriting was his. He could see his own peculiar way of crossing T's and dotting I's. But he had no memory of writing it, and the paper's obvious age suggested it had been created long before he'd inherited the manuscript. At 3:33 a.m., the harp began its nightly performance. This time, Elias didn't hum along. Instead, he sat in perfect silence, watching the shadows cast by his reading lamp. As the music swirled around him, those shadows began to move independently of their sources, flowing across the walls like living things. In the largest shadow, cast by the grandfather clock, a shape began to emerge, tall, regal, wearing what might have been a crown or might have been horns. The figure raised one hand in greeting, and Elias felt an overwhelming urge to respond in kind. He kept his hands firmly in his lap. The music faded. The shadows returned to their proper places, and the figure dissolved back into ordinary darkness. But on the manuscript's open page, new words had appeared in that familiar handwriting. Tomorrow night, if you choose to know, speak the words beneath my sign. Elias spent the following day in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of normal life, while his mind churned with impossible possibilities. During his morning lecture on the Protestant Reformation, he found himself discussing the Catholic Church's suppression of Gnostic texts with an intensity that left his students shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The question we must ask ourselves, he heard his voice saying, is whether the Church suppressed these texts because they were false or because they contained truths that threatened orthodox doctrine. What if the heretics weren't wrong about God, but about the nature of knowledge itself? A student raised her hand. Professor Rowe, are you suggesting that esoteric knowledge might actually be real? Elias paused, realizing he'd strayed far from his prepared notes. I'm suggesting that the line between belief and knowledge is thinner than we often admit. The medieval mind didn't distinguish between psychological truth and objective reality the way we do. For them, a vision was as real as a sunrise. But surely you don't believe in magic? Another student asked. The question hung in the air for a long moment. Elias looked out at 30 young faces, all waiting for their professor to reassure them that the world was rational, predictable, safe. 6 months ago, he would have given them that reassurance without hesitation. I believe, he said finally, that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. The lecture hall was unusually quiet as students filed out after class. Several lingered, clearly wanting to ask follow-up questions, but Elias packed his materials and left quickly. He couldn't trust himself to maintain the facade of academic objectivity much longer. At the Bodleian, he spent hours in the medieval manuscript collection, searching for any reference to Palon or the Eight Seals. The librarians knew him well enough to grant access to materials normally restricted to senior researchers, but his search yielded nothing. It was as if the entity existed only in his uncle's collection, a unique revelation that had somehow escaped the notice of every other scholar in the field. Or perhaps it hadn't escaped their notice. Perhaps it had been deliberately omitted from the historical record by those who understood its true nature. That evening, Elias stood in Mortimer's study holding the handwritten translation, feeling the weight of decision like a physical presence. The rational part of his mind insisted that this was all elaborate self-delusion, stress-induced hallucinations triggered by his uncle's death and the intensity of working with allegedly occult materials. The academic in him demanded he document everything carefully, maintain proper scholarly distance, approach the phenomenon as a subject of study rather than experience. But another part of him, a part that had been growing stronger since he'd first opened the manuscript, whispered that some knowledge couldn't be approached through conventional means. Some truths required participation rather than observation. The grandfather clock chimed 11, 2.5 hours until the daily manifestation, if that's what it was. Elias lit several candles around the study, not from any ritual purpose but because their flickering light seemed more appropriate than the harsh electric bulbs. He placed the manuscript open on the desk, weighted down with a brass paperweight shaped like a sleeping dragon. At midnight, he began to notice the symbols. They appeared gradually, so subtly that he almost missed them. First as shadows that seemed slightly too complex for their sources, then as reflections in the window glass that didn't quite match the room's contents. The sign of the crowned one, that shifting glyph he'd drawn obsessively over the past few days, began to manifest everywhere he looked. In the wood grain of the desk, in the pattern of dust motes dancing through candlelight, in the spaces between letters on printed pages. By 3:30 a.m., the entire study was alive with symbols. They covered every surface, overlapping and interweaving until the room looked like a vast manuscript written in languages that predated human speech. The candle flames guttered but didn't die, casting impossible shadows that defied the laws of physics. At 3:33 precisely, the harp began to play. Elias stood, the translation trembling in his hands, and spoke the words of the Eighth Seal. Palon, Rex Scientiae, Magister Umbrae, I who know nothing call upon you who know all. I offer my certainty as sacrifice, my ignorance as altar. Teach me the price of wisdom. Show me the weight of truth. Let understanding remake me as it remade those who came before. The music swelled, no longer confined to a single instrument, but expanding into a full orchestra of sounds that had no earthly origin. The symbols on the walls began to glow with their own inner light, pulsing in rhythm with the otherworldly symphony. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming viscous like honey, making each breath an effort. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, he appeared. Palon the Crowned stood 7 feet tall, his form composed of shadow and starlight woven together into something that suggested human shape without quite achieving it. His face was beautiful in the way that mathematical theorems are beautiful, perfectly proportioned, completely inhuman, terrible in its absolute symmetry. The crown upon his head was made of crystallized thoughts, each facet reflecting a different aspect of knowledge that mortals were never meant to possess. When he spoke, his voice resonated not through the air but directly into Elias's mind. You have called, and I have come. You have offered ignorance, and I accept. Are you prepared to learn what your uncle learned, to understand what drove him to seek death as release from understanding? Elias tried to speak, but found his voice had deserted him. He managed only a nod. Then let us begin, Palon said, extending one hand toward the trembling scholar. First, you must understand that knowledge is not a possession but a transformation. You cannot hold truth as you hold a book. You can only become it. Are you willing to be remade? Another nod. Very well. Touch my hand and let the lesson commence. Elias reached out, his fingers trembling as they approached that impossible extremity. The moment their skin met, reality shattered like glass struck by lightning. He was standing in his own study, but it was different, older, covered with dust and cobwebs as if decades had passed in an instant. The manuscript on the desk was open to a page he'd never seen before, covered with his own handwriting in that strange script. As he watched, the The words rewrote themselves, shifting from Latin to English to languages that had never existed. "This is your first lesson," Palon's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "Time is not a river but an ocean. You have been here before, will be here again. Your uncle discovered this truth too late to save himself, but perhaps you will prove more adaptable." The study dissolved, replaced by a vast library where books wrote themselves on shelves that extended infinitely upward. Elias saw himself at different ages, as a child reading fairy tales, as a seminary student struggling with doctrine, as a young priest losing his faith, as a middle-aged academic finding purpose in scholarship. But there were other selves too, versions that had made different choices, followed different paths. In one reflection he saw himself still wearing a collar, an old priest dying peacefully in a parish rectory. In another he was a madman in an asylum, drawing symbols on the walls with his own blood. In a third he was something that might once have been human, but had transcended the limitations of flesh through an understanding too profound for mortal minds to contain. "Which is the true Elias Rowe?" Palon asked, materializing beside him in the impossible library. "Which path represents reality?" "All of them," Elias whispered, finally finding his voice. "None of them. The question itself is meaningless." "Good. You begin to understand. Knowledge does not reveal truth. It reveals the illusory nature of certainty. What seems most real is often most false. What appears impossible is often most true." The library faded, replaced by darkness so complete it seemed to have substance. In that darkness, Elias heard voices: Uncle Mortimer, his parents, his sister, colleagues from the university, students whose names he'd forgotten, all of them asking questions, demanding answers, expecting him to know things that no human being should ever be required to know. "This is the burden of the Eighth Seal," Palon explained. "To know is to be responsible for knowing. To understand is to be accountable for understanding. Your uncle spent 30 years trying to forget what I taught him, but some lessons cannot be unlearned." "Why?" Elias asked. "Why offer knowledge that destroys the knower?" "I do not offer knowledge," Palon replied, his voice carrying a note that might have been sadness in a more human throat. "I offer the recognition of ignorance, the understanding that all certainty is delusion, all answers are provisional, all truth is subjective. This recognition either liberates the seeker or annihilates them. Most choose annihilation." The darkness began to lift, revealing Mortimer's study once more. But now Elias could see it truly, not just as a room filled with books, but as a nexus point where multiple realities intersected. The manuscripts on the shelves weren't just texts, but windows into different possible worlds. The symbols carved into the desk weren't decorations, but functional elements in a vast machine designed to process meaning itself. "Now comes your test," Palon said, his form beginning to fade as dawn approached. "I will ask you a question. Answer with certainty, and you will join the ranks of those who were consumed by their need to know. Answer with doubt, and you may yet survive the lesson." The entity's form solidified once more, taking on an aspect of terrible authority. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute judgment. "Tell me, Elias Rowe, what is the nature of reality?" Elias felt the question settle into his mind like a weight that threatened to crush his sanity. Every instinct screamed at him to provide an answer. He was a scholar, trained to respond to questions with knowledge, to meet inquiry with information. The academic in him began formulating responses. Reality was material existence, verifiable through empirical observation, or reality was the sum total of conscious experience, or reality was the intersection of subjective perception and objective truth. But as each potential answer formed, he felt Palon's presence pressing against his thoughts, not intrusively, but with the patient attention of a teacher waiting to see if a student had truly learned the lesson. The understanding that all certainty is delusion. "I don't know," Elias whispered. "Elaborate," Palon commanded, his voice carrying echoes of cosmic authority. "What is it that you do not know?" Elias closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every philosophy course he'd ever taken, every theological debate he'd participated in during his years as a priest, every academic paper he'd written with such confident assertions about medieval religious thought. All of it suddenly seemed like elaborate exercises in self-deception. "I don't know what reality is," he said more firmly. "I thought I knew. I've spent my entire career studying how people in different eras understood existence, analyzing their beliefs as if I possessed some superior vantage point from which to judge their accuracy. But I don't even know if my own perceptions are reliable, let alone whether the material world actually exists independently of consciousness." The shadows in the room began to shift, flowing toward Palon like living things drawn to their source. "Continue. I don't know if this conversation is real or if I'm having a psychotic break. I don't know if you're an actual entity or a projection of my unconscious mind. I don't know if my uncle really discovered forbidden knowledge or if he simply succumbed to the same delusions that run in our family. I don't even know if knowledge itself is possible. Maybe all we can ever have are provisional models that seem to work until they don't. And what does this not knowing teach you?" Elias opened his eyes, meeting Palon's impossible gaze. The crowned figure no longer seemed terrible, but infinitely patient, like a parent waiting for a child to understand a simple but crucial lesson. "It teaches me that uncertainty might be the most honest position available to conscious beings," Elias said. "That admitting ignorance might be the beginning of wisdom rather than its absence. That the need to know, really know, with absolute certainty, might itself be a form of madness." The study began to brighten, though dawn was still hours away. The light seemed to come from the symbols themselves, as if his words were causing them to release some energy they'd been holding in reserve. "Your uncle answered differently," Palon said, his form becoming translucent. "He insisted that reality was whatever could be verified through ritual, that truth was whatever produced consistent results when the proper words were spoken in the proper order. His need for certainty consumed him. He died trying to prove that his experiences with me were objectively real rather than subjectively transformative." "Were they?" Elias asked, then immediately shook his head. "No, that's the wrong question. It doesn't matter whether they were objectively real. What matters is what they did to him, how they changed his relationship with uncertainty. You begin to understand the true nature of the Eighth Seal. It is not a conjuration but a confession, an acknowledgement that the seeker's relationship with knowledge itself is fundamentally flawed. Most who attempt this working seek power through certainty. They want to know secrets that will give them advantage over others, truths that will resolve their existential anxiety once and for all. But power built on certainty is brittle, and anxiety dissolved through false knowledge returns tenfold." The candles in the room began to gutter, their flames shrinking to tiny points of light. The symbols on the walls faded like writing in sand disturbed by wind. "The lesson is complete," Palon said, his voice now barely audible. "You have learned what your uncle could not, that wisdom lies not in accumulating certainties but in developing comfort with uncertainty. You will remember this experience, but you will never be entirely sure of its objective reality. That uncertainty will be your protection and your gift." "Wait," Elias called out as the entity began to dissolve entirely. "What happens now? Do I just go back to my normal life? Pretend none of this happened?" "You go forward," Palon replied, his words echoing from very far away. "But you go forward changed. You can no longer approach knowledge with the arrogance of certainty, nor can you dismiss mystery with the smugness of skepticism. You must find a third way, a path between credulity and cynicism, between knowing and not knowing." The last of the shadows flowed away like water seeking its level, leaving Elias alone in the study. The manuscript on the desk was closed, its binding cool to the touch. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, showing 4:17 a.m. On the desk where the handwritten translation had been, he found only a single sheet of paper with a message in his own handwriting. "Some doors once opened remain open forever, but you have learned to walk through them with appropriate caution. Your uncle would be proud." Elias woke in his own bed, sunlight streaming through windows he was certain he'd left curtained. For a moment, he experienced the disorientation of interrupted dreams, fragments of impossible libraries and crowned shadows lingered at the edges of his consciousness, too vivid to dismiss as mere nightmare, yet too strange to accept as memory. Then he saw the books. Every volume on his shelves, texts he'd collected over decades of scholarly work, familiar companions in multiple languages, now bore titles and scripts he'd never seen before. Not the flowing glyphs he'd been drawing unconsciously, but something else entirely. Angular, precise characters that hurt his eyes to look at directly, yet somehow conveyed meaning despite their alien nature. He stumbled to his desk, searching for some anchor of familiarity. His lecture notes for the day's classes were there, but written in the same incomprehensible script. His computer displayed text in what appeared to be corrupted fonts, every character replaced by symbols that suggested meaning without conveying it. Only one thing remained unchanged, a leather-bound journal he'd kept for personal reflections, rarely used but always present on his desk. Opening it revealed his final entry, dated 3 days ago, written in perfectly normal English. Uncle Mortimer's inheritance arrived today. I don't know what I expected, but this manuscript feels different from his usual acquisitions. The text seems to shift when I'm not looking directly at it. I should be more skeptical, but something about this feels significant. Below that, in what appeared to be the same pen but different handwriting, shakier, more urgent, were the words, "If you're reading this, then you've completed the working and returned to this branch of the timeline. The books have changed because your relationship with knowledge has changed. You can no longer read anything with complete confidence in your interpretation. This is not a curse but a gift, the gift of perpetual uncertainty. The choice is before you. You can fight this transformation, insist on the reality you think you remember, and slowly go mad like so many others who've walked this path. Or you can accept the uncertainty, learn to find peace in not knowing, and discover what lies beyond the need for absolute truth. Choose wisely. Your sanity depends on it." Elias set the journal aside and moved to his bathroom mirror. His reflection looked back at him with eyes that seemed subtly different, not changed in any way he could articulate, but somehow more aware of their own limitations. As he watched, the reflection's mouth curved into a small smile while his own face remained neutral. He was not afraid. The realization surprised him. By all rights, he should be terrified. His books were unreadable, his reflection behaved independently, and he possessed memories of conversations with an entity that may or may not have existed. Yet instead of the panic he'd expected, he felt something closer to relief. The constant pressure to know, to understand, to have answers for every question that plagued the human condition. All of it had lifted like a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. His phone buzzed with a text from the university. Faculty meeting moved to 2 p.m. "Hope you're feeling better, Margaret." The message was in English, perfectly legible. Whatever had changed his relationship with written knowledge seemed selective, affecting only certain types of text. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say that his ability to read had become conditional, dependent on the nature of his relationship with the material. He dressed carefully, choosing his most conservative suit, as if armor against whatever strangeness the day might bring. The walk to campus felt different, as if he were seeing familiar streets through slightly altered eyes. Students hurried past with their eternal urgency, but now he noticed how their certainty manifested in their posture, their quick, decisive steps, their animated conversations about subjects they felt qualified to judge. He remembered being that young, that sure of his own perspectives. His morning lecture was on the Council of Nicaea, a subject he'd taught dozens of times before, but as he stood before his students, the familiar narrative felt hollow. How could he speak with authority about 4th century theological debates when he was no longer certain about the nature of knowledge itself? "Today we're discussing how the early church established orthodox doctrine," he began, then paused. The words felt strange in his mouth, weighted with implications he'd never considered before. But perhaps we should start with a different question. How do we distinguish between truth and consensus? When the bishops gathered at Nicaea to debate the nature of Christ, were they discovering theological reality or creating it? A student raised her hand. Emma, one of his brightest pupils. "Surely there's a difference between religious belief and historical fact, Professor. We can study what they decided without having to take a position on whether they were right." Elias found himself studying her face, noting the absolute confidence with which she separated objective analysis from subjective belief. 6 months ago, he would have agreed with her without reservation. "Can we?" he asked. "When we study these debates, we bring our own assumptions about the nature of truth, authority, and knowledge. The very act of analysis changes what we're analyzing. We're not neutral observers examining dead history. We're living beings interpreting the past through the lens of our present understanding. Another student, James, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Are you saying we can't know anything about history? That it's all just opinion? The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Elias felt the familiar academic impulse to provide a clear, definitive answer, to reassure his students that knowledge was possible, that their education had meaning beyond mere intellectual exercise. Instead, he said, I'm suggesting that our relationship with knowledge is more complex than we usually admit. We can gather evidence, construct theories, test hypotheses, but the moment we claim absolute certainty about anything, especially anything as complex as human motivation or divine truth, we've probably overstepped the bounds of what finite minds can actually accomplish. The lecture continued, but he could sense his students' discomfort. They'd come expecting solid ground, dates, names, clear cause and effect relationships that would help them navigate their exams and their lives. Instead, he was offering them quicksand, the vertigo of uncertainty. After class, several students lingered with questions that weren't really questions but requests for reassurance. He did his best to provide perspective without false comfort, to acknowledge their concerns without dismissing the complexity that had prompted his new approach. Margaret cornered him in the corridor afterward, her expression mixing concern with professional wariness. Elias, I couldn't help overhearing parts of your lecture. Are you quite certain this philosophical approach is appropriate for undergraduate students? They need foundational knowledge before they can grapple with epistemological questions. Do they? He asked. Or do we assume they need certainty because we're uncomfortable with our own uncertainty? Margaret's frown deepened. I think you should consider taking some time off. This inheritance business has clearly affected you more than you realize. Perhaps a sabbatical. I'm fine, Margaret. Better than fine, actually. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm teaching something that might actually matter. But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were true. The distinction between honesty and delusion had become genuinely unclear, and he wasn't sure whether that clarity of uncertainty was wisdom or madness. The faculty meeting that afternoon proved surreal. His colleagues discussed budget allocations and curriculum changes with the same earnest confidence he'd once shared, but now their certainty seemed almost quaint. They spoke of measurable outcomes and evidence-based decisions as if the universe were a vast machine whose workings could be understood through sufficient application of rational analysis. Dr. Hawthorne from the philosophy department was arguing for increased funding for critical thinking courses. What students need most is the ability to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources of information. In our current climate of misinformation, the university has a responsibility to teach objective reasoning. Elias found himself speaking before he'd consciously decided to contribute to the discussion, but who determines which sources are reliable? What criteria do we use to distinguish objective reasoning from collective bias? Hawthorne looked at him with surprise. Well, the scientific method, peer review, established scholarly consensus, all of which are human institutions created and maintained by human beings with human limitations, Elias interrupted gently. I'm not suggesting we abandon rigorous inquiry, only that we acknowledge its provisional nature. The room fell silent. Margaret was giving him a look that clearly communicated her growing concern for his mental state. Dean Carmichael cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we could table this discussion for another time, the dean said. Dr. Rowe raises interesting philosophical questions, but today we need to focus on practical matters. The meeting continued, but Elias felt increasingly disconnected from the proceedings. His colleagues' comfortable assumptions about knowledge, truth, and academic authority seemed to belong to a world he could no longer fully inhabit. That evening, he returned to his flat to find Mrs. Henderson waiting in the lobby, looking more alert than he'd seen her in years. Dr. Rowe, she said, her voice carrying an urgency that surprised him. I need to speak with you about the music. His blood went cold. Music? The harp playing, every night at 3:33 for the past week. It's been keeping me awake. She paused, studying his face with sharp eyes. But you knew about it already, didn't you? I can see it in your expression. Elias felt the world tilt slightly. Mrs. Henderson was deaf, profoundly, completely deaf. He'd assumed the music was auditory hallucination, a product of stress and suggestion. You can hear it? He asked carefully. Hear it, child? I can feel it in my bones. Music like that doesn't just touch your ears, it touches something deeper. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. Your uncle used to visit me, before he died. Told me he'd found something that would change everything, but that the price might be higher than anyone should pay. What did he tell you exactly? Mrs. Henderson glanced around the empty lobby, then gestured for him to follow her to her flat. Inside, her living space was exactly what he'd expected. Doilies, family photographs, the accumulated comfort of 8 decades. But on her mantelpiece, incongruous among the domestic memorabilia, sat a small leather journal. He left this with me, she said, retrieving the book. Made me promise to give it to you if anything happened to him. Said you'd know when the time was right. Elias accepted the journal with trembling hands. The leather was warm to the touch, worn smooth by decades of handling. On the cover, embossed in faded gold, was a symbol he recognized, the shifting glyph that had haunted his dreams, the sign of Palon the Crowned. Mrs. Henderson, he said slowly, how long have you been able to hear? She smiled sadly. Since the music started, since your uncle's work began to manifest. Some changes reach further than we expect, Dr. Rowe. Some knowledge affects not just the seeker, but everyone around them. Opening the journal, Elias found pages of text in Mortimer's familiar handwriting, but the words shifted and changed as he watched, cycling through languages and scripts like a living document, adapting itself to its reader's needs. The first entry he could read clearly was dated 6 months before Mortimer's death. The boundary between self and other is more permeable than we assume. My work with the Eighth Seal has begun affecting my neighbors, my environment, perhaps reality itself. Mrs. Henderson's hearing has returned, not through medical intervention, but through proximity to expanded consciousness. The young couple upstairs reports dreams in languages they don't recognize. The postman claims my letters sometimes bear addresses that don't exist until he delivers them. I begin to understand why the text warned that some doors remain open forever. Knowledge doesn't stay contained within the individual consciousness that receives it. It spreads, transforms, remake not just the knower but the known. Elias looked up to find Mrs. Henderson watching him with eyes full of compassionate understanding. What happens now? He asked. Now you decide, she said simply. Your uncle chose to fight the changes, to try to put the knowledge back in its box. That's what killed him. Not the knowledge itself, but the effort to unknow what couldn't be unknown. And the alternative? You accept the uncertainty. You let the knowledge flow through you without trying to contain it or control it. You become a conduit rather than a vessel. She paused, her expression growing serious. But you should know, that path changes everything, not just for you, but for everyone whose life touches yours. The music you've been hearing, that's just the beginning. As if summoned by her words, the sound of the harp began to drift up through the floorboards, though it was barely 9 o'clock. Mrs. Henderson tilted her head, listening to melodies that existed somewhere beyond the normal spectrum of human perception. It's starting earlier tonight, she observed. The boundaries are weakening. Elias clutched Mortimer's journal, feeling the weight of decision settling over him like a familiar coat. Through the window he could see Oxford's ancient spires silhouetted against the evening sky, centuries of accumulated knowledge reaching toward heaven, monuments to humanity's endless quest to understand its place in the cosmos. But now he knew something those stones could never teach, that understanding was not a destination but a journey, not a possession but a relationship, not a solution but a deeper, more beautiful form of mystery. The harp played on, and slowly, carefully, Elias began to hum along. 3 months later, Dr. Elias Rowe's final lecture drew an unexpectedly large crowd. Word had spread through the university that the medieval historian was concluding his career with something unprecedented, a talk titled The Necessity of Not Knowing Toward a Pedagogy of Uncertainty. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity, with students sitting in the aisles and faculty members standing along the walls. Some had come out of genuine curiosity about his increasingly unorthodox teaching methods. Others were drawn by rumors that Professor Rowe had suffered some kind of breakdown, that this would be their chance to witness academic self-destruction in real time. Elias stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. In the front row, Margaret Thornfield sat with the careful attention of a colleague, preparing to document concerning behavior for administrative review. Near the back, he spotted several graduate students who'd been attending his recent classes with expressions ranging from confusion to fascination. "For 20 years, he began, I've stood in rooms like this claiming to teach medieval history. I've presented dates and facts, analyzed causes and effects, offered interpretations of past events as if my understanding could somehow bridge the gap between their world and ours. Today, I want to suggest that this entire enterprise has been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what education can and should accomplish." A murmur rippled through the audience. Margaret's pen moved across her notepad with surgical precision. "We live in an age that demands certainty," Elias continued. "Our students expect definitive answers. Our institutions reward confident assertions. Our society lionizes expertise, as if the accumulation of specialized knowledge were the highest human achievement. But what if this obsession with certainty is precisely what prevents us from learning anything of real importance?" He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the crowd. In the third row, a young woman named Sarah, one of his most promising graduate students, was leaning forward with the intensity of someone encountering an idea that might change everything. "The medieval scholars I've spent my career studying knew something we've forgotten, that the deepest truths are approached through questions, not answers. They called it docta ignorantia, learned ignorance, the recognition that the more we truly understand, the more we realize the vastness of what we don't understand." A hand shot up from the middle of the hall. "Professor Rowe, are you suggesting we abandon empirical inquiry, that evidence and reason have no value?" "I'm suggesting," Elias replied, "that evidence and reason are tools, not gods. They can help us build provisional models of reality. But the moment we mistake those models for reality itself, we stop learning and start indoctrinating ourselves and others." Another hand. "But surely some things can be known with certainty? Mathematical proofs, historical facts." Elias smiled, remembering his own absolute confidence in such distinctions. "Can they? Mathematical proofs depend on axioms we choose to accept. Historical facts are interpretations of evidence filtered through countless layers of human bias and limitation. I'm not saying these frameworks are useless. They're incredibly valuable tools for navigating existence. But tools have limitations, and acknowledging those limitations might be the beginning of wisdom rather than the end of knowledge." The questions continued for another hour, growing more passionate as students grappled with ideas that challenged their fundamental assumptions about education, truth, and intellectual authority. Some were genuinely intrigued by the possibilities he was outlining. Others were clearly disturbed by the implications. When the formal session ended, perhaps 30 people lingered for informal discussion. They gathered in small clusters, voices animated with a particular energy that emerges when comfortable assumptions are suddenly called into question. Sarah approached him as the crowd thinned. "Professor Rowe, what you're describing sounds almost mystical. Are you suggesting there's some spiritual dimension to uncertainty?" Elias considered the question carefully. Over the past 3 months, he'd learned to recognize when his experiences with Palon were influencing his thoughts versus when he was drawing on more conventional insight. The boundary between the two had become surprisingly fluid. "I'm suggesting that mystery and uncertainty might be features of reality rather than bugs in our understanding," he said. "If consciousness is truly as limited as we seem to be, then approaching existence with intellectual humility might be more realistic than approaching it with confident analysis. But how do we teach that? How do we build curricula around uncertainty? We ask better questions. We focus on process rather than content. We model intellectual humility instead of claiming expertise we don't actually possess." He paused, watching her expression. "We admit when we don't know, and we help students develop comfort with not knowing." Margaret materialized at his elbow with the persistence of institutional concern. "Elias, we need to talk, privately." The remaining students dispersed with the reluctant energy of people leaving a party that was just getting interesting. Sarah lingered until Margaret's pointed attention made her departure inevitable. "Walk with me," Margaret said, leading him out of the lecture hall and onto the campus quad. Evening shadows stretched across ancient stone, transforming familiar spaces into something subtly otherworldly. "The dean is concerned," she said without preamble. Your teaching evaluations have become polarized. Half your students claim you're the most inspiring professor they've ever encountered. The other half think you're having some kind of crisis. Which half do you think is right? Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him. In the gathering dusk, her expression was difficult to read, but her voice carried genuine care beneath the professional wariness. I think you're one of the most brilliant scholars I've known, and I think you're in danger of destroying everything you've built. This obsession with uncertainty, this rejection of academic authority, it's not sustainable, Elias. The university can't function if every professor starts questioning the fundamental premises of education. Maybe the university needs to be questioned, and maybe you need help. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Have you considered speaking to someone? A counselor, perhaps? Grief affects people in different ways, and your uncle's death. I'm not grieving, Margaret. I'm learning. Learning what? Elias looked up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were becoming visible despite Oxford's light pollution. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the faint sound of bells marking evening prayer at one of the colleges. The sound reminded him of his years as a priest, when he'd believed that faith and knowledge could coexist without fundamental tension. I'm learning that the questions might be more important than the answers, he said finally. That admitting ignorance might be the first step toward wisdom, that the universe might be stranger and more mysterious than any of our theories can capture. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentler. And what happens to your career, your research, your students who need you to provide guidance, not just questions? I don't know. The admission came easily now, without the anxiety that had once accompanied any acknowledgement of uncertainty. And I'm beginning to think that not knowing might be exactly what my students need most. They walked in silence for several minutes, following paths that had been worn smooth by centuries of scholars grappling with similar questions about truth, knowledge, and the proper relationship between human minds and the vast mystery of existence. As they reached Margaret's office building, she turned to him one final time. Promise me you'll think about what I've said, whatever you've experienced since your uncle's death, whatever insights you think you've gained. Promise me you'll consider the possibility that you might be wrong. Elias smiled, remembering Palon's final test, the crucial importance of answering with uncertainty rather than knowledge. I promise you, he said, that I consider that possibility every day. That's exactly the point. Margaret studied his face in the lamplight, searching for signs of the colleague she thought she'd known. Finally, she nodded and disappeared into the building, leaving him alone with the evening and his impossible certainty that uncertainty was the only honest response to existence. At 3:33 a.m., in his flat above Mrs. Henderson's increasingly alert presence, the harp began its nightly performance. But now other instruments had joined the ethereal symphony, sounds that had no earthly origin, melodies that existed in the spaces between conventional musical notes. Elias sat at his desk, working on what would be his final academic paper, toward a hermeneutics of mystery, medieval approaches to unknowing in contemporary pedagogy. The words flowed easily, as if they were being dictated by some part of his mind that had learned to think in languages more precise than English. On his bookshelf, volumes that had been unreadable for months now displayed their titles in scripts he was gradually learning to decipher. The process was slow, requiring a kind of attention he'd never developed during his years of conventional scholarship. But each symbol that resolved into meaning brought with it not answers but deeper, more beautiful questions. His reflection in the window smiled back at him, no longer synchronized with his own facial expressions. He'd stopped finding this disturbing weeks ago. If consciousness was strange enough to generate the illusion of individual identity, why shouldn't mirrors sometimes reveal the provisional nature of that illusion? The music swelled, filling his flat with harmonies that suggested mathematical relationships beyond human comprehension. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear Mrs. Henderson humming along, her voice carrying melodies in languages she'd never studied, expressing ideas she'd never consciously encountered. The boundaries were indeed weakening, just as she'd predicted. But rather than chaos, what emerged was a strange kind of order, not the rigid structure of absolute knowledge, but the flowing coherence of minds learning to dance with mystery rather than wrestle it into submission. Outside his window, Oxford slept on, its ancient stones holding centuries of accumulated learning. But in the spaces between established facts and the margins of certified knowledge, something new was taking shape, an approach to truth that began with confession of ignorance and proceeded through questions rather than answers. Elias wrote until dawn, each sentence an exploration rather than a declaration, each paragraph an invitation to wonder rather than a claim to understand. When he finally set down his pen, he realized he'd written the last academic paper he would ever complete. Not because he was abandoning scholarship, but because scholarship, as he'd finally learned to practice it, was not about building monuments to human knowledge, but about cultivating appropriate awe in the face of inexhaustible mystery. The harp fell silent as the first light of morning touched his windows. In that silence, Elias heard something he'd been listening for without realizing it, the sound of his own mind learning to be comfortable with not knowing. It was the most beautiful sound he'd ever encountered. 3 months later, former Professor Elias Rowe sat in the reading room of a small private library in a village whose name appeared on no conventional maps. The books surrounding him were written in languages that changed depending on the reader's relationship with certainty. The other patrons were scholars who had learned through various means that the deepest truths could only be approached obliquely. He was not unhappy. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged, in the space between knowing and not knowing, helping others navigate the beautiful terror of genuine mystery. And every night at 3:33 a.m., wherever he happened to be, the music played on.